Welcome to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to have you with us and happy to welcome Mackenzie France back to the program. Mackenzie, for the sake of those who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment here. Tell us a little bit about what you do for Young Voices as well as some of the other things that you do.
Hi, Brian. It is a real pleasure to be back with you as always. Yes, my name is Mackenzie France, and I am the Director of Strategy at an organization called the Pinsker Center. We are a foreign policy think tank focused on the Middle East and general foreign policy. For Young Voices, I'm a senior contributor, and I've written mainly on foreign policy issues, but also on a couple of other general US politics issues as well. I'm really happy to be with you today to talk about such an important issue over in the UK.
Yeah, covering the Middle East, I'm sure you have your hands quite full, but I'm looking at your article here about the BBC's Israel problem has been apparent for years. And I don't think it's just the BBC. I think when it comes to reporting on Israel, a lot of media outlets kind of struggle to find the balance that we normally associate with journalism. Help us understand the situation as it pertains to the BBC and the way that they cover Israel.
Well, of course, Brian, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It is definitely not just a BBC problem, but this specific sort of explosive incident in the UK has come from a leaked internal memo that was published last month. Essentially, it was written by a man called Michael Prescott. He was a journalist himself, and he'd been advising the BBC on editorial standards. And you can see in the memo, it documents just a litany of basic reporting errors, editorial standard errors, and there's also quite a large expose into the BBC Arabic service as well, which is essentially flipping the reality on its head in a lot of the cases of the stories that it reports on Israel. I think obviously with a conflict like Israel and Palestine, the information on the ground is so scarce and hard to come by, and things move very fast. But this really, Brian, should be a cause for stricter and more rigorous editorial standards, not laxer. In my article, I discussed this specific incident at Al-Ahli Hospital where the BBC was sort of editorializing about what the cause of the explosion could be before the IDF had even had a chance to comment, saying things like, oh, well, it's hard to see what else this could be. That's just not the job of news journalists. Their job is to report the facts, not their own opinions, especially when you've got such an impressionable audience on a big UK institution like the BBC.
It seems that the conflict in Israel, especially what is going on in Gaza, is such a polarizing situation. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn when I say this. The parties that are involved, Hamas certainly has its propaganda wing. I believe that Israel has its opinion shapers and people who go to work to lobby for its viewpoint. But back to what you were saying about the media is supposed to be above all of that and looking for facts. Where is the BBC particularly dropping the ball? Are they reporting particularly for their Arabic edition? Or are they trying to report what they think the audience wants to hear as opposed to what the actual facts might be?
Well, I think the problem actually stems with the state of the free press in Gaza specifically. It is hard to overstate the total control that Hamas has over Gaza and the people of Gaza, and that is down to journalists as well. You can see in the BBC Arabic service that there are reporters used or stories from correspondents, and when you look at the individuals, the sort of blatant anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric is very apparent. There was one journalist on the BBC Arabic service, and I use that term loosely, who said that Jews should be burned just like Hitler did to them. And he appeared, according to this internal memo, over 200 times on BBC Arabic in less than 2 years. So I think if you want to discuss sort of where the problem is coming from, I think it has to stem from the sorts of stories and correspondence that are being used at source.
Well, I just know that when there is a military conflict, whether it's large or small, truth is always going to be more elusive because each side wants to portray their side as the victim or, justified in what they're doing. But this one seems to have taken on a whole different nature. And I'm curious, when you hear people throwing around words like genocide, that's pretty serious stuff. That's not just a difference of opinion. I mean, we're talking, didn't they try and hang people, following World War II for that kind of thing? So it seems like having preciseness in language would count. Who bears the primary responsibility for that? Is it the press itself? Do the consumers of press have a responsibility to vet what they're being told?
Well, look, I think especially, I think actually Israel and Gaza has demonstrated this problem perhaps better than any other conflict in recent years. The conflicting nature of the information and the speed of which information is coming out, I think everybody has this sort of responsibility. But for an institution like the BBC, the reason why this is such a big problem is, somebody like myself who works in foreign policy full time, it's part of my job to vet and verify these things. But for somebody who's just turning the 6 o'clock news on to see what's going on, this should be the gold standard of verifiable factual information that people are getting on their TV screens. People don't have time to sift through hours of fact checking or hours of this side said X, other side said Y. So when you have an institution like the BBC that is trusted to give you the facts, the objective way that things have happened, they really shouldn't be either directly reporting falsehoods, as we've seen the BBC apologize for, or when the situation is still unclear and the fog of war is certainly not dissipated, they should not be editorializing about what their reporter on one particular day thinks has happened. It's just not the way that the BBC is on other issues, and I think they have to get a grip of this particular problem. That was
actually the next question I had for you was, has the BBC shown favoritism, or have they shown bias in areas besides this? I agree with the examples you're citing. This is really egregious, the bias here, but have they surrendered their objectivity in other issues as well?
Well, I think it's been a particular subjective debate in the UK over the past few years, and the BBC itself is becoming more sort of politicized. What might shock a lot of American viewers is that everybody who basically has a television and uses BBC services in the UK has to pay a compulsory license fee. You can go to court and be fined if you choose not to pay. I know that's a very alien idea for American listeners. So fundamentally, Brian, because of that, it is a political issue, and some parties have been campaigning on scrapping the license fee for exactly this reason. When the UK was going through the Brexit debate, there was a sort of joke amongst conservatives that the BBC had this phrase, despite Brexit, the sun was shining despite Brexit, X, Y, Z. So I think there's been long time questions over the BBC's editorial slant, not only over Israel, but other issues. And that's certainly an issue for the UK to settle politically.
Mackenzie, it seems like the big casualty here isn't necessarily just one side or the other, but when issues like this are being fought out in the court of public opinion and people are being given opinions rather than facts, that tends to muddy the water to where, and I'm just speaking like as someone who is removed from the situation, I no longer know who to believe.
Absolutely. And with a conflict that you've already addressed the seriousness of this, and we can all see this genuine human suffering on both sides. And anything that we can do to get closer to the truth and sort of agree on the same set of basic facts, I think now we're in a situation where we can't even do that. The muddying of the water, it leads to so many problems of if I don't believe the BBC on X, should I believe them on Y? And I think this is honestly the root cause of a lot of the dehumanizing rhetoric we see on both sides. Starting from a point of editorial fairness, I think is the real root problem here.
Okay, we've got just under a minute here, but I have to ask, who bears the primary responsibility here then for affecting change? Is it the government or the BBC insofar as the two of them interact? Is it on the consumers of that information to turn it off and show through, voting with their feet, we won't consume content that we can't trust?
Well, look, the Director General of the BBC has resigned over this, and I think that they recognise that there has to be a level of institutional responsibility. But as I've already said, a lot of UK politicians are really protective about the BBC as an institution, and if they want to make sure that the BBC is an institution that goes on, that doesn't get killed off politically, they should be putting the thumb on the scales of the BBC to internally sort this out. Otherwise, it will be settled through the court of public opinion and through politics. And a lot of people think that would be a great shame to see an institution like the BBC go by the wayside.
Again, we're talking with Mackenzie France, Director of Strategy at the Pinsker Center and also a senior contributor for Young Voices. Where can people find you? Where can they follow you on social media?
My main social media is X, and that's simply Mackenzie_FR. Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's a pleasure to speak to you, as always.
Recording in progress.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Cláudia Nunes to the program. Cláudia, good to see you once again. For those who are meeting you for the very first time, please take a moment to tell us about who you are and what you do.
Hello, my name is Cláudia Nunes. I'm from Lisbon, Portugal, and I'm a policy analyst.
And I'm looking at an article you've written for fairobserver.com about how California's crackdown on pharmacy benefit managers could actually raise, not lower, drug costs. Now, we've had a few conversations with Young Voices contributors over the last few months about PBMs, or pharmacy benefit managers, and I feel like it's been explained to me in a way that I can see them as a benefit, for the purpose that they serve. Why is California cracking down on them?
Well, California basically consider them the villains in all this story. They think that PBMs retain a big part of the money, but in fact PBMs are responsible to lower the prices and not the opposite.
Let me take a quick step back too, just for the sake of those who may not be familiar with the role fulfilled by a pharmacy benefits manager. What exactly do they do? What purpose do they serve?
Okay, PBMs negotiate drug prices on behalf of the insurers, employers, and patients. They pull millions of consumers together, which gives them a bargaining power against the pharmaceutical companies that otherwise would set prices very, very high.
Okay, I mean that seems like a pretty
challenged at least.
Okay, I mean that seems like a very practical reason for them to exist. So what is what kind of regulations is the state of California trying to place on PBMs?
I did my note. Let me check my notes. They want to restrain their flexibility. They want to restrain the fact that they they cannot own pharmacies, and they want to impose spread pricing. That is simply one way of the PBMs are paid. So through the difference between what a health plan pays and what a pharmacy is reimbursed, it covers operating costs and risk. And obviously, once again, banning it doesn't make drugs cheaper. It removes a tool that supports price stability, and it's very, very, very important. So they think they are doing something good, but it will lead to the opposite effect.
Does the public understand this, or do they believe that the state is saving them from these villains?
To be honest with you, I'm not aware of the public opinion on that, but to be honest, that type of restrictions didn't work in other states like Arkansas, for example, and Alabama. So there's no point in believing that it will work in California as well. But I think they will have to wait and see. Because one of the consequences of restraining PBMs is the fact that you can, despite of having higher drug prices, you also can lose some pharmacies. So in most remote places, this is bad, obviously.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the pharmacies in more remote areas would go out of business, or would have to go out of business because they don't have a PBM to negotiate low enough drug prices to make it profitable for them to stay in business? Am I understanding that correctly?
No. Basically, PBMs, they also own pharmacies on their own, and one of the restrictions that California wants to impose is that a PBM cannot own a pharmacy. So sometimes in some remote areas, the PBM's pharmacies associated are the only pharmacies that actually exists. So if you are a PBM and you cannot own a pharmacy at the same time, in fact you are creating a big problem to these remote areas. Basically, they will lose sometimes the only option that they have.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining that to me. Now, when you mentioned that the PBMs are being portrayed as villains, my first thought was, they must be making so much money. But in your article, you explained that the profit margins aren't as high as people would think. What kind of profit margins are we talking about?
2%, more or less. For example, if a drug price is $100, let's make it up, PBMs only retain $20, and the majority of this value, in fact, will reflect on a benefit to the final consumer. So it's a very low margin that they keep from themselves, and it's in fact what is acceptable for them to continue to operate, because they need to have at least a very slow margin of profit, obviously, but the major beneficiaries in the end are the consumers.
You notice, or rather you note in your article that this kind of intervention, as in the case of SB 41, actually weakens the people who could bring down the drug prices, and it puts more power in the hands of those who set drug prices. Tell me, Cláudia, what's the better way forward? How can we address the problem of high drug prices in a better, more productive way that doesn't result in the state substituting its agenda for what the consumers want or need?
Okay, I think that's the general answer for how the market works, and we know that when there is state intervention, things tend not to work very well. So I think the best way is the states not to intervene in this matter, and let the markets just flow, because that's a better way to do it.
Actually, I'm 100% on board. But sometimes it feels like people are either persuaded or they're even trained not to trust the market. Well, I believe in the free market, but just in case, let's have the state regulate this or regulate that so I get an outcome that I want. It seems like we have to put aside those desires to meddle or to have the state meddle to really let the market work its magic.
Yes, that's true. Did you ask me something?
Let me ask you this.
Okay.
SB 41, is it now law in California? It's been signed into law, correct?
I believe it is, yes.
Is there any movement to repeal this law, or perhaps replace it with something that better reflects, the free market?
To be honest with you, I don't have any data regarding to that, but I will find out for sure.
Okay. It's looking at your article, it seems like you're giving those who would like to see SB 41 repealed, you're giving them a lot of good ammunition to work with, because you've got some very solid logic about how this intervention is actually hurting the consumers. Are there any resources that you would direct people toward if they wish to find out more information about the issue of pharmacy benefit managers and in this case, SB 41?
Okay, as I understood while talking with my North American friends, it seems to me that PBMs is not something that, in fact, people have a lot of information about. I thought that the fact that I'm Portuguese and a foreigner writing about it obviously make it a very new subject for me, but again, it seems like, in fact, my North American friends sometimes don't even know what PBMs are.
Again, we're talking with Cláudia Nunes. She is a Portuguese writer and a policy analyst and a senior contributor with Young Voices. Where can people find you on social media?
They can find me at Cláudia Shandy at X, or Cláudia Shandy Liberty in Instagram, where I do some videos mostly about Portugal and European Union, but I have English subtitles.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we are happy to welcome Jack Rowlett back to the program. Jack, it's a pleasure to have you here. For those who are meeting you for the very first time, let's take a moment here and give you a chance to properly introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, thank you so much for having me. So I am a British political commentator. I've been with Young Voices for about 3.5 years now, and I do appearances on media across the UK. I often write about the British economy and our rules around housing and planning, and technology regulation as well, which is, I think, what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I have only just within the last few weeks started to get my mind around the Digital Markets Act, or DMA. And one of the things that really brought it to the forefront was just in the last few weeks. I think the social media platform X was like the last stubborn holdout to refuse to conform to the DMA and its standards. And in return, I think the European Commission said, fine, we're going to fine you then, what was it, 120 million euros?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think X's case is that they shouldn't be classed as one of these gatekeepers under the Digital Markets Act, and that's the threshold that you really don't want to reach if you're a big tech company, because it's really bad. So in essence, what the Digital Markets Act does is it says if you're a technology company of a certain size, so that's measured by turnover is one measure, and another measure is by the amount of users. If you breach those thresholds, then you become subject to a whole ton of extra bureaucracy and regulations that the European Union forces upon you. And one of the worst ones is this interoperability requirement. And this essentially means that companies that have kind of built their reputation and built their products on the basis that they work really well together and they provide a sort of ecosystem, if you like, of products that function well side by side. It means that they then have to take the technology that they've developed, that they've paid to develop, that they've invested in and rolled out. They then have to take that technology and make it work with everybody else's technology as well. And this is really bad because when consumers decide the products that they want to buy, they're not looking for products that are exactly the same. It's those differences that mean we go for option A over option B. And what the Digital Markets Act is doing with technology products, for example, the iPhone and its Android-based competitors, is basically forcing them to become more similar. And that's really bad for consumer choice.
Yeah, I love this line from your article. The DMA is antitrust gone rogue. So there may have been some good intentions about, hey, we're just trying to protect the consumers, but it sounds like it's a concept that was taken too far to the point where now it actually harms innovation and competition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is the case that sometimes when we look at companies that are really large, sometimes they have got to that position by abusing their market power, right? But sometimes companies that are large because they're successful, because people like their products, right? And by forcing them to sort of change their ways, you actually make the end user experience for consumers worse. So, for example, in Europe now, Google has to make loads of changes to search results to basically pull in data from their competitors. So if you're looking at, let's say you're planning a route, you're driving somewhere, you're planning a route. Before the Digital Markets Act, when you were searching for directions on Google, you would get data from Google Maps, which is basically universally recognized to be the best mapping software. But now, because of these changes under the Digital Markets Act, Google has to pull in data from worse competitors. And so the end user experience is actually people are just getting worse directions, right? And so the impact, you mentioned innovation there before, and that's a really important point too, because the consequence of this is that companies are looking at these new regulations and they're saying, well, actually, we're just not going to bring the new features we've developed to Europe. So, for example, Apple's, they've recently developed this live translation feature for their AirPods. It translates the language that other people are speaking in real time. It's great. Not coming to Europe because the Digital Markets Act interoperability requirements mean it's just not worth it. It's too much of a risk for Apple. And there's loads of other features like that aren't coming either. And so the end result is that consumers are left with worse choice and they're left behind by the rest of the world.
That is really disappointing. I mean, talk about a tool that could be so useful. And not to mention, I think you pointed to, this is actually causing companies to reconsider, building up new firms there in Europe. Talk about what this tale can teach America so that it can avoid making similar mistakes? First of all, is the U.S. in danger of following a similar kind of pattern?
Yeah, I think it is. So if we look at kind of some of the debates that are happening in Washington at the moment, I think you're seeing sort of an increasingly bipartisan skepticism of big tech, if you like. I think there's concerns among Republicans in Congress that these big tech companies are suppressing free speech and therefore they want to find a way to punish big tech. And then you have concerns in some parts of among some Democrats that these companies are just too big and they don't really like big successful companies, right? So it's a sort of left-wing concern from that side. And so there are now pushes to bring in sort of similar regulations in America as to what's taking place in Europe. There's two big pieces of legislation at the moment. I heard the Open Markets Act and the App Store Freedom Act, which have bipartisan support in Congress and would bring in sort of similar regulations. And that would be absolutely ruinous. You look at the economic effect that this has had on Europe. It's no coincidence that all of these big tech firms that we love and that we use every day, they're all American. None of them are European. And that's because the regulatory environment in Europe is just not, it's too hostile. And the result is that there just aren't those big tech firms. In Europe. We've seen over the last 10 years that a third of European unicorn tech startups have actually gone abroad to raise capital because it's just not worth doing in Europe. European tech firms have raised about $800 billion less than American firms over the same 10-year time period. So it's having a really ruinous effect on the European economy. And if I was an American looking at that, I would think the absolute last thing I want to do is copy this disastrous regulatory regime.
No, you actually make a very strong case in your article. You don't deny that there are times when there is real abuse, and you give the example like when manufacturers block developers from even telling users about alternative payment options. But that's not the same thing as totally mandating how they have to create their entire platform.
No, it's not. Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned that. And there are these cases where you could say, okay, well, a company is abusing their market position. I think they're not allowing developers to say that there are alternative payment systems. I think that is a good example. And so you could argue that that's something that the EU has done right, but they've just gone far too far in all these other areas. And so, when people choose, Apple products, for example, they're choosing those products because they work well together. They're choosing those products precisely because they're a walled garden and they don't, you don't have the same privacy risks, the same security risks that you have on Android. And equally, people who choose Android devices often do so because they want them to be more customizable and open-ended. And so the previous system gave people the choice. Depending on what your personal preferences are, you can go for one or the other. But by forcing them to become more similar, we not only reduce innovation, but we also destroy the things that consumers already value about these products. Because if you've made that choice to buy an Apple product, well, now, tough luck. You're left with a system that looks increasingly like the Android products that you didn't want in the first place.
That is very, very well stated. I like how you put this too, where you say true competition happens when companies can pursue distinct philosophies. And I love this part. And consumers can choose what works for them, because if the consumers have that choice, that's where the magic seems to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to return to America, that's what America has done so well over the past, several centuries, really. And so, that's the approach that has led to all these dynamic companies setting up in America, to all this innovation happening, and to America being able to export that innovation to the rest of the world. It's why Europe doesn't have competitors in that space. And so I think America essentially doesn't really need to change much about its current approach, because it's working really, really well. And you only need to look at all the new companies that are starting up in the AI space to see that that's going to continue into the next generation technologies as well.
I love how you say, the DMA can't be reformed because it confuses consumer choice with monopolistic practice, and that's the fundamental error. Is there any chance that the DMA will be scrapped at some point?
I think it's very unlikely. I think too many politicians in Brussels have staked too much of their reputation on this legislation for them to be willing to change it anytime soon. I think, unfortunately, it may well just end up being too late, and they won't realize the scale of their mistake until it's far too late to change it.
It's a great object lesson, though, for America, and hopefully they'll take the hint. Again, we are talking with Jack Rowlett. Jack, where can people find you on social media?
So people can find me on X at Jack_nostalgic, and I also write the Build Vector Substack as well.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Satya Marar back to the show. I know we've had you on here actually fairly recently, but I know there are also people hearing you for the first time. Tell us just a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. I'm a lawyer and economist, and I'm a research fellow at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. I mainly write and research on antitrust law, competition and innovation policy. And I've been doing a lot of writing on drug prices and competition and how we preserve the incentives for companies to innovate, bring new cures to market while ensuring, competition and cheaper prices for Americans.
Yeah, I'm looking at an article you did for the DC Journal. And Satya, I have to tell you, I had to go double check and make sure my sarcasm meter was properly calibrated. The headline was, "Great news, Britain to pay more for U.S. drugs." And I went, is he being sarcastic? Were you being sarcastic with that?
No, not at all. So for a long time, other countries have been using, with public health systems, single-payer healthcare, as they call it, like Britain's National Health Service, have been securing, cheap drugs, even patented medications for their own constituents by negotiating drug prices. So what they do is they use what's called buyer monopsony power. The public insurer represents millions of patients. You basically have to deal with them if you're entering that market to negotiate the lowest price possible for these drugs. In the US, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid are prohibited by law from doing that for most drugs until, in 2026, they're opening it up for a few drugs. But generally speaking, they have to pay prices, that is CMS, pays prices pegged to the American private market. So what insurers pay, what private patients pay. So what this does is it encourages pharma companies to inflate the price they charge Americans. Sort of almost as a way, in a sense, compensating for the lack of revenue they get for the same drugs overseas. Now, because, they will get that higher price for every single drug that Medicare and Medicaid buys, even if private insurers don't buy as many drugs as they otherwise would at a lower price. So as a result, the US is indirectly subsidizing innovation, pharmaceuticals, or all of these other countries, while Americans pay 3 to 4 times more for the same drugs that those countries pay. And this trade deal is really a way to, in the long run, make things fairer, spread out that burden, because we all benefit from these drugs, and most of the innovations coming out of the US. So it's only fair that Britain, under this deal, will pay 25% more to their National Health Service for the drugs that Americans are still going to pay more for.
Yeah, this is actually one of the few cases, I think, where I've seen something positive about, Trump and his tariff agenda. I know that there are mixed feelings. When some are saying, well, the tariffs are going to save America. Others are saying, well, now we're paying more for everything. But as you describe in the article, this actually turns out to be a win-win for both the UK as well as for the US.
Absolutely. During the first Trump administration, there were a lot of folks who said, okay, look, I don't like the idea of tariffs, but if you're telling me that there's another country that's imposing them on our exporters, and we can find a way that we can get them to get rid of their tariffs, and we can both end up with more free trade in the end, then maybe it's worth doing. I guess a lot of the issues that people have had with, some of Trump's proposals have been that they don't end up playing out that way. That may not even be the intention. He talks about how tariffs are great for raising revenue and so on, even though the people paying for them are you and I when we get something from overseas. So what's interesting is, there's sort of two approaches this administration has taken with drug prices. The first is threatening to tariff or penalize drug makers, pharma companies, telling them if you don't lower your prices, we're going to fine you, we're going to revoke approval for your drugs, we're going to tariff you if you try to bring ingredients into the country. If those threats go ahead, we're all going to suffer, right? And in a sense, if those companies say, okay, fine, don't do this to us, we'll lower our prices, that's a price control. And what that means is less money that's available for researching and innovating and developing new drugs. Now, this strategy of trying to use trade leverage as a way to get other countries to pay more than they do is a much better option. It's not a price control on US firms. It preserves the incentives to bring in revenue and develop and innovate. You can use it as a stick. You can tell the drug company, hey, we negotiated this deal. Britain or Canada, whoever, agreed to pay more for the same drugs. In return for that, compensate us with lower price in the US. So that's a good way forward.
I'm going to ask you to let me pick your brain for a moment here, just talking about the cost of drugs, because I think most people who've had to fill a prescription recently will say, wow, everything is so expensive. Walk me through why it is incredibly expensive to put a new drug on the market. And I know this is not well understood by most people, including myself, and that's why I'm appealing to you. What does it take to get a new drug from conception to on the market? It's not just a snap your fingers and it's done thing, is it?
Not at all. It is incredibly complicated, incredibly expensive, incredibly risky. It's been estimated that it costs well over $1 billion, up to $2 billion every year nowadays, to develop and bring a new drug, a new discovery from start, researching, trials, all the way to bringing it to market, getting the approvals, marketing it, developing it into a form that you can sell to consumers. And the reason why we're able to do that and why firms will make this crazy decision to spend so much money on what's really a risky bet that may never yield a successful drug. Only 1 in every 12 trials or something succeeds in many cases. And we're talking about pharma companies needing to get, 62% profit margin on the few drugs they have that actually work and can sell to make just a 4% return on all of their investments. So, it's really incredibly risky. There's a lot of money involved. And the only incentive for them to do this is if they can make that much more revenue in the long run over the course of the patent. So the patent gives them exclusive right to sell, develop, market the drug, and so on. And then at the end of the patent period, usually 20 years or so, and there are a number of different patents on a drug, but over time, they tend to expire. Generic drugs can enter the market, but generic drugs will not enter the market at low prices if there's nothing for them to replicate. And what's interesting is, yes, we pay a lot of money for these drugs, and some would argue we absolutely should because it costs a lot to create them. But if you include the fact that the US accesses generic drugs before everybody else does, overall, patented and generic drugs, we actually pay 18% less on average for drugs than those other countries that have the single-payer healthcare systems.
Yeah. Thank you. That is a process that I think is out of mind and out of sight for a lot of people. And that still just blows me away that so few of the drugs that actually are, that they're conducting trials on ever actually become commercially valuable or viable. It's just astonishing.
Yeah. So they have to make a return on even the failed projects when they sell something that is successful. It's like shooting fish in a barrel.
So is this likely to open the doors for further win-win kind of compromises, maybe even outside of pharmaceuticals? We're talking, drugs and bringing down drug prices, but are there other places where this kind of a policy might also yield, a better deal for both countries as far as, the tariffs?
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, tariffs are a tactic. They can be used in a way that is strategic and targeted and has clear goals. And, at the end of the day, it's in the interest of the world's countries to deal with the U.S. The U.S. has incredible leverage. One of the things that Trump has talked about that's also worth exploring is this idea of getting rid of regulations that harm U.S. competitiveness, U.S. business. Now, these regulations at home, which unduly harm and burden American companies, also burden foreign companies trying to do business in the US. So we call these anti-competitive market distortions, not a catchy title, but they often fly under the radar. Everyone talks about tariffs and quotas and subsidies. These affect international commerce too. And what the administration can do is they can tell these other countries, we will repeal regulations that harm our businesses and yours in the US. And in return for that, give us a good deal. Let our exporters access your markets, tariff us less, give us more access to your customer base and so on. And I think that will be a win-win for everyone concerned. Marvelous.
For people who want to take a little bit deeper dive into this subject, are there any sources that you would recommend that a layman, could readily access and understand?
I have a number of articles on the subject that explain it clearly. I have an article in Discourse magazine called How America Subsidized Medicine for the Rest of the World, co-authored with Jacob Rich from the Reason Foundation, who's also with Young Voices. That's a great starting point. I've written articles on Trump's deals with pharma companies to lower prices of Ozempic and other GLP-1s for a blog called Truth on the Market. So these are a good place to start. And you can also follow me on Twitter, on X, that is, or on LinkedIn for more of my work.
Very good. Thank you so much for your time today. And, happy holidays. I guess we're going to be taking our break for the next 2 weeks. We won't be producing a podcast episode, but I look forward to talking with you in the coming year.
Yep, absolutely. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and see you in the new year.
And to you as well.